He was in Hiroshima when the nuclear bomb went off. And he saw the flash, and he saw this wave of destruction coming toward him. And he sat down and he said, "This will not affect me." The next day, when rescue workers were going through the ruins, they found this guy sitting naked there. All his clothes had been incinerated, burned off, and blown away. And he was completely intact. Completely intact. He was obviously revered as a national treasure in Japan, but it's an example of how it doesn't matter what's going on. A nuclear bomb is going off. You're going into a dark age. A dictatorship and censorship have taken over the land, and freedom of speech has been extinguished, and people are being put in jail for not having the right attitudes, not enough social credit, like in China. And this doesn't have to affect you.
Hello, everybody. You're listening to Chatting with Candice. I'm your host, Candice Horback. Before we get started, if you want to support the podcast, you can go to chattingwithcandice.com. And from there, you can sign up for my Patreon account where you get early access to episodes and bonus content, or you can click that little link that says Buy Me Coffee. Both things help me out a ton. Every dollar really does count. And another simple way that you can support the podcast is simply by sharing it with a buddy, leaving a 5-star review and comment. Those things are all tracked and will help me to continue to grow. So this week, I'm really excited to have Dr. Hardt join the podcast. He is the founder of Biocybernaut, and you've probably heard me mention Biocybernaut before in the past. It was truly a life-changing experience for me. I'm actually going to be giving away 3 autographed copies of his book, and if you want a chance to win, all you have to do is be following me on Twitter at Candice Horback or at Fall in Lovia, or you can follow me on Instagram at Candice Horback or at Lovia Longtime. Either account is fine. And when I post the promotional material, you just have to share it with your social media following. It's that simple. And I will pick 3 lucky winners to get an autographed copy of his book. And I can't overstate it enough. It's truly life-changing material. Also, last note, if you do end up getting a curiosity sparked with Biocybernaut and you decide to book, just let them know that Candice Horback sent you, because then it gets me a discount on my future trainings, which is really exciting. I'm actually trying to schedule my Theta 1 training for hopefully this year. So help me get a discount on that, please. So without further ado, help me welcome Dr. Hardt. So for the listeners, I've talked about Biocybernaut a lot and how it has deeply affected me as a person, as a wife, my overall happiness. I just feel lighter. I just completed Alpha 2 just a couple weeks ago. I've experienced profound healing through it. And if you would have told me this years ago, I would have said nonsense. Like, there's no way that this is real. But I'm a walking example. Can you give a brief description as to what you do at Biocybernaut and the technology that you have a patent on?
There are actually multiple patents that cover both the technology and the methodology. We have method patents because it turns out that the amazing results that we get at Biocybernaut are due to what might call 3 pillars. Let me have something to put the pillars on. Okay, one pillar is the patented ergonomic technology. This includes electronic circuits and computer code to run the circuits. The second pillar is the also patented optimized training protocols. For example, we do 7 consecutive day trainings. You couldn't get anywhere near the results if you came once a week for 7 weeks. Mass practice is more powerful here. And the third pillar is the transformational perspective of the trainer. This is a type of work that you really can't optimize doing it alone. And part of the reason for this is the ego. which has a vested interest in you not becoming more conscious, because the more conscious you become, the less control the ego has of you. And for any control freak, to lose any aspect of its control over that which or that whom it is controlling is something pretty close to a disaster for the control freak. And so the transformational perspective of the trainer is essential. At the end of each session in the chamber, the trainees, we call them, who are in the training, doing the training, gather in a room with canopied beds where they can sit or lie as they give their report. When an astronaut or a biocybernaut comes back from a mission, they don't go out for pizza or take a jacuzzi. They immediately go into a debriefing so that all the subtle details of the cool things that they experienced get to come out, and that way they're transferred from short-term memory, where ego would quickly make them fade. They're transferred into long-term memory, and there are witnesses to what happened. So the ego has a much harder time of getting people to forget the amazing breakthroughs, the amazing experiences that they've had. Mm-hmm. And so we have three pillars: the patented ergonomic technology, hardware and software, the also patented optimized training protocols, and then the transformational perspective of the trainer, which is an oral transmission. It can't be communicated in a writing or in a video. The trainer candidate actually needs to be with me and go through some trainings and pick up, and then it activates their intuition. I've recently introduced you to one of our trainers, and had complimented him on how initially, when he was first in training with me, and we were in the debriefing in the canopy room, he would have what I called zingers, which would be one-liners, which would go right to the heart of whatever the resistance was that the trainee was dealing with. And so this is a unique skill and a gift. And it is something that is awakened in someone and transmitted in an oral transmission and oral tradition. So that's kind of why the Biocybernaut training is unique. I mean, things that are patented, nobody else can use or do, or maybe even know the details about. Mm-hmm. And so the results range across the entire spectrum from dysfunctional to hyperfunctional. People can come in largely dysfunctional and in a week be functioning high-end normal. If people come in normal, in a week, they can go on into hyperfunction. And so the central, of the roughly 7,000 people who've come to do this training, some form of it, there's only one thing that I've found that's common in their motivation, and that is they're all interested in change. Mm-hmm. And so some people want change to get away from bad things, bad thoughts, bad ideas, bad emotions. And others want to acquire or expand good things like creativity, intelligence, motivation, positive thinking, and success in every realm of endeavor in which humans quest for improvement and success. And it's all available by changing the brainwaves. There are so many areas of improvement that, not so much now, but in the past, people would come to me and they would say, Biocybernaut seems like snake oil, because you say it benefits people in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. How can one thing have benefits across the whole spectrum of people's lives? And I say, well, it does. And it does benefit people across the whole spectrum of everything they do and experience in their life. But it does it by really doing only one thing. The Biocybernaut training improves central nervous system function. Improves central nervous system function. And once that improves, then anything that people use their brains and minds for will show improvement. So you find the source of excellence and happiness, and you teach people how to make more of that, and benefits abound in every area of a person's life.
So with the benefits, how long do they last, and do you recommend maintenance to keep those, like your creativity engaged or your IQ and your EQ at that new elevated level, or does it tend to be permanent?
Well, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. I do recommend that people do additional trainings. We've discussed previously how in Buddhism, there's over 150 attainment levels in consciousness. Some of them are huge steps up, and some of them are smaller steps up.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, I could tell you a story, not now, but later, if you remind me, about an 80-year-old Buddhist monk very close to the Dalai Lama, who he had gone to a lab to have his brainwaves measured, and some very cool things happened. So regarding the attainment levels, well, we can come back to that later. But in terms of the improvements that people make, they in fact go across a wide spectrum. And depending on the type of brainwave changes and the amount, these improvements range from large to gigantic. And so it's possible when you change your brainwaves, you change your identity. That's one of the new themes in the Biocybernaut, where we're coming out of the closet about some of the mystical sources and the portals to altered states that are available within the training, which in the past we haven't talked much about. Particularly, for example, there is a brainwave pattern known as the angel pattern, which when I see it, and I ask people, do you see angels or do you talk to beings that other people don't see? They always say yes. And so there are doorways to the transcendent, to the infinite, to the divine, that are literally littered along the hallways of Biocybernaut. And sometimes people will, in the course of their training, happen to open one or more of those doors and journey off into Everland, and then come back and have amazing stories. On the other hand, some people are more prosaic in their methods and their goals. And in the past, we haven't urged them to go beyond their comfort zone. But now this is changing as the age is changing to be more open, to have more transparency. And so we are beginning to tell people about the portals to alternate realities that are readily available in Biocybernaut trainings.
That's one of the, I guess, most profound changes that I've experienced, especially during Alpha 1, is you've kind of set me on this path of spirituality and just asking questions and spending more time reading and following people in like the mystic world. It actually started with, you know how you have like those giant quartz crystals in each room? I think I had asked you about
selenite crystals.
So,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I was asking you, like, what crystal is that and what was the purpose of it?
Well,
and it just sent me down a rabbit hole.
Well, yeah, definitely. Alice in Wonderland. Alice went down the rabbit hole and discovered quite an amazing world. One bite makes you taller, one bite makes you small. There were white rabbits and mad hatters and hookah smoking caterpillars sitting on big mushrooms. So, yes, a lot of fun there.
Mm-hmm. So we had talked about this earlier, but I think it's important. What made you make the decision to be so open about the spiritual aspects of the brain training and not just leave it super corporate, not just say this will help you make more money, this will help you, be more creative. You, in almost all of the days that you show up, you learn like a little bit more on the spiritual side or a little bit more on the mystical side.
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it has two entirely different answers. Before I go there, I will sort of underscore what you just said, because in the past, we would talk openly with people about the IQ boost. Your IQ goes up on average 11.7 points, and this is stable at least a year out, or the creativity, which increases 50%, or the beneficial personality changes. At one point, I'll tell you a couple stories about the personality changes. It was the early 70s, and I was analyzing data from my doctoral dissertation, where I had given batteries of personality tests before and after the training. And I'd done this both at Carnegie Mellon and in a lab I'd built there, and also in Dr. Joe Kamiya's lab at University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Joe Kamiya is the scientist who accidentally discovered in the early 60s that people could voluntarily control their own brainwaves if given feedback. And he made the first published report in April of 1962 at the Western Psychological Association meeting. This set off a firestorm of interest in sort of electronic Zen. People were very interested in that, but most of them were so ignorant of how to build the technology so that it worked with the alpha rather than against it. An example of working against it. Anytime you have your eyes open, you have lower alpha than if they're closed. So a lot of the early machines had a meter you had to watch with a needle that would go this way if it was more alpha, this way it was less, or lights that got brighter if you made more alpha. That's like trying to teach somebody to smile by slapping them every time they smile. And feedback might be accurate, might be immediate, but it's certainly not aesthetic. And effective feedback needs to be all three: accurate, immediate, and aesthetic. So when I came into the field, one of my jobs was to sort of clean house, get people to stop using the percent time measure that most were using for feedback and scoring. It's like a rubber ruler. It suffers from gauge variance. And so a lot of the early work was sort of putting the field of brainwave feedback on a scientific stance with accurate and defensible measures. And then when I came into the field, 90% of all the published studies, because people had gotten really excited, oh my God, electronic Zen, let's do studies. 90% of all the published studies showed that people could not learn to increase their alpha above an eyes closed resting baseline. And I was able to show that there were methodological and technological problems that if these were fixed, then yes, people could learn. And so I set about to design and build the world's best brainwave filters. And also I built the world's first microcomputerized brainwave feedback and analyzer system. And so with this technology power and what I knew from my own trainings, how to do the trainings, you don't do an hour a day, 3 times a week. If you're going to really make transformational kinds of changes, it has to be profound in mass practice, long days, consecutive days, like we do at Biocybernaut. Mm-hmm. So the being open about this came with penalties. If you're out ahead of the herd, you are vulnerable to getting arrows in your back from people that don't like you or afraid of you. Mm-hmm. When I wanted to do my PhD in brainwave feedback in the psych department of Carnegie Mellon University, I was referred to the man who controlled the equipment, the electrophysiological lab, Dr. Terrence W. Barrett. And so I went in and just happily, talked to him about the brainwaves of Satori, the superconscious state in yoga, or samadhi, and Satori is the superconscious state in Zen. And he listened impassively, didn't say much. And a couple hours later, I get a letter in my university lounge department mailbox. Permission to use the electrophysiological equipment denied. He continued, nobody who has an interest in consciousness could possibly be serious about getting a PhD in physiological psychology. But if you will abandon these silly ideas of consciousness and submit yourself to me, I will design a program of research which will lead to a PhD in physiological psychology. That definitely was not, shall we say, supportive or encouraging. I was aghast. What about academic freedom? Psychology, science of the mind. You can't study consciousness? Oh dear. So I took the letter to the acting dean, the dean of the department school was on sabbatical that year. And the acting dean was Richard Hayes, Dr. Richard Hayes. And he was the only one in the department who was actually studying consciousness. He was a Piagetian following Jean Piaget, the French developmental psychologist, who had identified 4 different stages of the development of intelligence in children. Sensory motor stage goes up to about 18 months. Then you have operations and concrete operations. And finally, at age 7, people go into formal operations where for the first time they can take the perspective of another person. If you give crayons and a paper to a 6-year-old and ask them, sitting across the table from you, and ask them to draw what you are seeing, they will draw what they see. It's impossible for them to conceive that you might have a different perspective on the world than they do. It's one of the reasons that we don't do this training for children under 7. I can recall on my 7th birthday, I was walking through the woods near Menominee, Wisconsin, wondering, I wonder if other people see red the same way I do. That is a question that could not occur to a 6, 5, 4, 3-year-old. And so Dr. Hayes took this letter, rolled his eyes, and the next day, Terence Barrett's dictum was reversed. In fact, his contract was not renewed. He wasn't there the next year, all of which earned me the enmity of all of the other physiological psychologists who were rat runners and things like that. And so they laid in wait. They were hostile. When I did the defense of my dissertation, my advisor, Dr. Jim Korn, scheduled my public defense for a time when the worst of the hostile people were teaching seminars and weren't able to come. They sent hostile questions, which I adroitly answered, and they weren't there to do follow-up hostile questions. So yes, telling the truth often creates anger in people who are afraid. You will remember from your own training that there's an emotional hierarchy, starting at the bottom with apathy, then sadness, depression, then anger, then fear, and then joy. And whatever, say you're blocking fear, what'll show up is anger. You'll express anger. If you're blocking anger, what'll show up is sadness. And so there was one other example about arrows in the back. When I won my large federal grant, in which I had written in 6-month and 12-month follow-ups, which will be an answer to your question of how long does this last, I was elevated on the occurrence. It was a big 3-year grant from NIMH, an R01 grant. I was elevated from an assistant research psychologist to an assistant professor of medical psychology in the august Department of Psychiatry. Shortly after this, the department chair decreed there would be an annual retreat. All faculty had to attend and get up on the stage and talk for 10 minutes about the research. So I've been doing, among other things, MMPIs, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventories, kind of like the granddaddy of all personality tests. And if you could show one of those profiles to a clinical psychologist, they could read that person's beads. It's very accurate. It has 3 different lie scales. Some scales are corrected, either up or down, depending on whether people are trying to fake bad or fake good or just generally malingering. And so for my 10-minute talk in front of the entire psychiatry department, I'm showing slides of the MMPI profile before the training and then 7 or 8 days later. Well, what I was showing were like the clinical scales: anxiety, depression, paranoia, schizophrenia, psychasthenia. Some of the people, because I was selecting, really damaged people using the MMPI first factor, I was getting people who were in the 98th and 99th percentile of schizophrenia, paranoia, anxiety, depression. And a week later, they were in the middle of the normal zone. Well, no psychiatrist on earth had ever seen that kind of change. And so I'm only halfway through my talk, 5 minutes in, and 2 senior bearded members of the department are out of their seats in the auditorium, shaking their fingers, waving their fists, angrily shouted me off the stage. Well, from the emotional hierarchy, the anger they were expressing is because of fear that they weren't willing to acknowledge that this youngest member of the department had a technology that was going to disrupt their august profession. They didn't need the drugs. They didn't need the on the couch talking. all they needed was a week of what became the Biocybernaut training. And so, as I said, I was literally shouted off the stage. Talk about academic freedom. So I've had arrows in my back by being a leader, by being out in front. And so even people who are afraid of the unconscious or the beyond conscious, they want more of the good things. They want more intelligence. They want more creativity. They want more emotional intelligence that's come on the scene recently. And they also want less anxiety, depression, fear, hostility. And all of these are available in the Biocybernaut training according to scientific research that I've conducted at major universities and then published in peer-reviewed, some of them peer-reviewed medical journals. So the science is there to support these sort of standard benefits, getting rid of bad things and getting more good things. And so that's what I would talk about. That's what I would use to introduce people to the training. And then when they would come in and they would have an out-of-body experience or they would see angels, I would say, oh, well, yes, as a matter of fact. And then here are the brainwaves that you're showing, and this is why you're. And then the other people in the training, because, we do this in small groups, the other people would recognize that here was like one of them who had unusual brainwaves and had unusual experiences. And so that's how it would come in. And it seemed safe, and it was safe for the people. But as I said, there were two reasons why I've decided to be, or have been compelled to be, more open about the portals to the beyond, the methods of transformation that are available in the Biocybernaut training. And one of those reasons is the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, which has changed. And so when the hippies came in with psychedelics and altered states of consciousness in the 60s, it freaked out the establishment in such a way that they did everything they could to shut it down. Dr. Timothy Leary, a Harvard professor, was thrown out of Harvard along with Dr. Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, because they were doing experiments with psychedelics that freaked people out. Dr. Alpert went to India, found a guru, and became Ram Dass, whereas Dr. Leary went around promoting psychedelics. And so to silence him, someone planted 6 marijuana seeds in the carpet of the passenger side of his car. And based on that, they put him in jail for 20 years. When he got out, he died shortly thereafter. So the establishment was not, shall we say, welcoming to a technology for altered states. Now, I think it really an intriguing, shall we say, coincidence that in the same year, 1962, that LSD became illegal in California. In that same year, 1962, is when brainwave feedback was announced. So one method for altering consciousness was taken away, and another one that was perceived to be safer was given. Now, if somebody, is slipped 1,000 micrograms of LSD in their brownie or their Coke, they will have a profound altered state of experience, regardless of whether they want it. And there can be a lot of fear. Whereas in the alpha training, you only get as much as you can handle, which is the good news, but it's also the bad news, because you only get as much as you can handle. And so if you're starting to go out of body in the chamber, as your alpha is rising, if any kind of fear comes up, the alpha will be diminished and the experience will be throttled back. And only when you get comfortable with that level of out-of-bodiness will you be able to continue. Other things like seeing astral plane beings. I mentioned angel pattern. And there is a pattern that I recognized long ago in my work, that when this pattern shows up, and it could be in a grandmother, it could be in a child, or it could be in a U.S. Army Green Beret soldier, when this pattern exists, they will perceive beings that don't have physical form. And for many years, usually around day 3 of the training, people would come out of the chamber and go, "Man, that was better than my best acid trip." It doesn't happen that much anymore, but remember brainwaves rule. And when you change your brainwaves, you change your experience of reality, you change your identity, And that changes your reality. That's one of the new themes that we're now public about. Because as I said, there's been a change in the zeitgeist. People, as we're going into a new yuga, a new age, we are all being under the influence of the benefits of greater openness, honesty, transparency. And so it's timely. There's a story that I told you one time about possibly an apocryphal story where two businessmen in business suits come onto a suburban train platform from opposite directions. They meet in the center of the platform and immediately fall into a very deep conversation. Meaningful, intriguing, train's late. When it arrives, they both, wanting to continue their conversation, step forward, the doors open, and one of them has a horrified look on his face and he pulls back. His new acquaintance, looking forward to continue the conversation, asks, well, aren't you coming? Aren't you taking this train? And the guy goes, no, I'm sorry. I'm not taking that train. Puzzled, the protagonist in this story, gets on the train. He's got to get downtown. He's business meeting. And so the train takes off, and the very first bridge that it goes over collapses. And as all the cars are falling into the abyss, he has a moment before impact to wonder, why didn't he tell me? And so I feel an obligation to tell people about the nature of reality that I see all the time when people change their brainwaves. They change their identity, which, according to Frederick Dodson in his amazing book, Parallel Universes of Self, identity and reality are synonymous. Maybe you could take a moment and tell us how, as you changed your identity, how your reality changed. That would be wonderful. Can you take the mic there?
So for me, I didn't really know what I was signing up for with Alpha One. I thought it was going to be a lot more corporate and like this will just help me more with my business. And that's all I kind of was expecting. And Eric knew full well what we were getting into, but he knew that would kind of lure me in. So we get there and I'm immediately hit with forgiveness work. And I'm like, what is this? I'm not forgiving these people. He doesn't know what they've done to me. So it brought to surface a lot of anger that had been, just dwelling inside me my entire adult life. And I realized I was attached to that anger. Like that was my identity. I was
righteous
and I
anger.
would try to, yes. And exactly. You kind of defend it, right? There's a reason for this and it's good.
It's my right to be angry.
And I don't have to change. They have to change. And I was the person that had a rough childhood. I was the person that had a pretty intense mom. I identified as those things. And when you start doing the forgiveness work, you realize you can, like you said, transcend. You can transcend those negative emotions and you can kind of re-script your past. And it's not changing it, but it's just seeing it from a different view, like a different vantage point that is beneficial. And I would say the biggest change, I was very much one of those people that life was happening to me. There would be something bad and I'd be like, of course this kind of happened. Right. And you see that a lot today too, right? And people are capitalizing on this victim mentality and trying to get people in that loop because then you can control that person. They're very, very malleable when you're like that. So I broke that identity and became the person that, the universe was happening for me. No longer things were happening to me. I was kind of in control of my destiny. My health got better. I was told I couldn't have kids from multiple doctors. And, shortly after Alpha One, a lot of other things implemented. Like I started my spiritual journey and I started meditating and I was a different person and I got pregnant. And my doctor was like, I don't know how this happened. You were not supposed to be.
It was impossible according to medical doctors. Yes.
It was impossible according to medicine. And we weren't even trying and it happened. And it was it's the best thing that's happened. It's improved my marriage by a long shot. I don't think that we would have had this level of communication and bonding because we did Alpha One together, and you go through all of your dirty laundry together on a fundamental level. So yeah, my identity changed a lot. It's no longer being powerless, I think, is also a part of what I've learned through Alpha One. It's, if something happens, you can make the best out of it, and you can choose to be, I always say, choose to be like the hero or the victim of your story. And I think that through your process, you teach people how to be the hero of their story.
Yes.
And that's just with Alpha One,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I'm still waiting for Alpha 2 to kind of integrate because that was super recent. It was only a couple weeks ago. And I feel like with your training, it's one of those things that takes months. And I mean, you don't even see the full effects, I don't think, until even years later because there's such a ripple effect. Like you might see some changes, right? You might see that all of a sudden money fell in your lap or you got that promotion or that your relationships improved. But that's like the tip of the iceberg.
Well, several things there. One, I want to talk about the victim perspective and also about how your reality changes when you change your identity. For a number of years, I was working with a philanthropist in Canada who dedicated $6 million US to scholarships. He sent people from his company. Brilliant man. He, with one partner, grew his company from 0 to $2 billion in just 2 years. Very astute businessman. And when he sent people from his company to the training, he saw how much improved they were when they came back. And he announced to my entire science advisory board at our first meeting that he considered the ROI, return on investment, of a Biocybernaut training to be 100. So if he sent people for $20,000 to the training, he got back an employee that he valued at $2 million more, an ROI of 100. And so as the Aboriginals came through, there were many of them who were profoundly disturbed. The racism in Canada was intense. Aboriginal cultures were destroyed in large part through what were called the residential schools. Children were ripped away from their parents or grandparents and sent 12 months a year to these schools to be brainwashed. They had signs in the schools, kill the Indian to save the man. Now, what they meant was kill the Indian culture to save the person for white culture. But in fact, Georgina Lightning, a trainee, who is a filmmaker, did an amazing film I recommend. It's called Older Than America, in which she documented that 50% of all the Aboriginal children sent to the residential schools died there. There were mass graves found around the schools. And so tremendous victimization of the Aboriginal peoples by the dominant English and French cultures. And so at one point, a member of my science advisory board, who was a full professor at the First Nations University, was doing the training. And around day 5, she broke into tears in the interview. And I said, well, what just happened? She said, oh my God, I realize I'm not a victim. All of my courses in the university are teaching the Aboriginal students how they have been victimized. I'm going to have to throw out my entire syllabus and design a whole new set of courses because I've been teaching these people, these students, that they're victims, and we're not. So the changes can be profound and then have ripple effects. These people go back to their lives, their universities, and they're different. Now, at one point, the scholarship sponsor, who had ear to ground in the reservations, the reserves in the Aboriginal community, he said he was getting evidence that people who just interacted with the people who had done the Biocybernaut training were showing improvements. And he asked me to design a study to see if that was the case. So I said, well, we haven't been collecting any data on that. And so he asked me to design a study, and I designed a 2-year study. And typical of this is how he grew his company from $0 to $2 billion in 2 years. He said, I want the answers by May. And this was, I don't know, like February. And so I go, oh, how am I going to do this? So I went back to the drawing board. I went into the chamber to download the answer. And so what I designed was a program, a survey with many hundreds of questions, and gave the survey, which could be done online, to the people. But with their permission, I also administered the survey to their family members, to their friendship networks and those who had jobs, to their coworkers. And to our utter astonishment, we found that there were measurable benefits occurring to people who never did the training. They only interacted as a family member, a friend, or a coworker with somebody who had done the training. So you know the word contagious, how things can spread, but it has a negative connotation. So I coined the word protagious instead of contagious. And so we actually have documented evidence that the multiple benefits of the Biocybernaut training are protagious. And I actually published this paper in a British online journal called EC, Psychology and Psychiatry, where we had anthropologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, ethnologists look at the data, and they concluded it was obvious that there were benefits showing up to people who only interacted with people who did the training, because high consciousness gets on people in the same way that it's wise to avoid people with a low vibration, negative energy. It's desirable to hang out around people who have a high energy because you'll begin to pick it up. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. One of the two reasons why I'm now more open about revealing to people the mystical sources of the benefits in the training. Now, as I mentioned earlier, being out in front, you get arrows in the back. People who are afraid, they get angry. And so, it's just time to deal with that. And one of the keys has to do with identity. You brought up the idea of your identity changing and then your reality changing. I've cited Frederick Dodson in his book, Parallel Universes of Self, to indicate that when your identity changes, your reality changes. Identity and reality, he says, are synonymous. And the Biocybernaut training has the ability to enable people to change at a level of identity. As Robert Dilts, one of the second-tier luminaries of the NLP movement, neuro-linguistic programming, said to me when he and I met around his new book, I think it was new in 1992, called Changing Beliefs. He said, when you can get people to change their beliefs, then the emotions under that change and the behaviors underlying the emotions change. And, I was supportive and encouraging and saying, yeah, that's really wonderful. And I said, here at Biocybernaut, we can assist people in changing at a level of identity. And he, jaw dropped, eyes got big. And he said, the only thing I know that can change a person at a level of identity is a spiritual awakening. And I smiled and I said, Robert, you said it, not me. And so people achieve these changes in identity through a spiritual awakening. And I think it's now time to be helpful more because, one, the change in the zeitgeist, where people are more open to this. And we tried it out in the last training where I showed up on day one and explained to people when we showed them the slide on changing identity. I then went further and said, when you change your identity, you change your reality because identity and reality are synonymous. And so in the forgiveness process, which you remember well, you have your court, you have your unimpeachable high beings, the judges. You bring in the person you're going to forgive and you charge them. Then you go into feeling the pain. And if your alpha drops sufficiently, so most of your scores turn white, then you can begin the forgiveness. The first step is decide to forgive. Second step is look for the good or the gift that came from this painful event. And then you go on walking in their shoes and so on. But that step, I asked everybody, there were 5 people in the training, a group of 3 and another group of 2. And I said, how long do you spend in deciding to forgive? And everybody said, well, just a moment. And I said, aha, I want you to amend that. I want you to do this differently. In the moment where you decide to forgive, maybe you don't know how, maybe you're not even 100% ready to forgive. It's my right to be angry. That person did such terrible things. So you may not even be fully ready. But when you decide to forgive, we tell people that's the first step. I explain to people in that moment, you are taking on, briefly, the identity of someone who has forgiven. Ooh, taking on a new identity. Well, we know that when you change your identity, you change your reality because they're synonymous. And so I ask people to linger in that moment where they decide to forgive and explore what it feels like to be a person who has forgiven. And so that was our first salient into introducing that. The second reason for now being more open and honest about this is that it's the truth. And I've gotten a lot of arrows in my back by being out in front. But at this point, I really don't care because this is what I know to be the truth. This is the truth as I know it. And so in the forgiveness process from all trainings, and I'm going to be teaching this to all my other trainers, including the one that just came from Germany for 2 weeks of retraining with me, in the forgiveness process, that step where you decide to forgive, which most people do in just a moment, I'm now instructing them to recognize that when you decide to forgive, in that moment, you have taken on a new identity. And we know that when you change your identity, you change your reality. And so the forgiveness process is extremely powerful. In fact, I could give you several examples. One, because my dear friend and trainer from Germany, at one point he had a family member come and do the training. And this family member forgave a brother who was in a different country. She had not talked to this brother in 7 years. The reason was there had been some wedding and this brother had made a disruption and kind of spoiled the wedding for everyone. So she cut off communication. 7 years, hadn't talked to him. So the day after she did her forgiveness on this brother, he contacted her on Facebook. So coincidence? Okay, let me give you another one. We had a married couple come for training. The husband was a Caucasian American male, and his wife was a Singaporean Chinese female. And she was showing a lot of anger on her mood scales. And when I dug in to find out the source of the anger, it was her aunt. Her aunt and her mother were identical twins. They had gotten married on the same day, different men. They had both given birth to a single girl child just a few days apart. And the mothers as identical twins were very close, and their children, cousins, were also very close. Well, sad part of the story was that the mother of the Singaporean Chinese woman died early. So her aunt took her on and raised her along with her own daughter. But the aunt was suddenly very mean. Like she would take the two girls, her daughter and her niece, clothes shopping, and she would only buy clothes for her daughter. If the daughter loaned a piece of clothing to her cousin and the mother found out, she would severely punish both girls. So this was a very, very mean aunt, kind of like the Cinderella stepmother kind of story. So she got away from that family. She got away from Singapore as fast as she could. And now she's living in America with her Caucasian male husband. And so when it comes up through digging around the sigma she was getting on anger words, this story about the mean aunt, she undertook to forgive the aunt. And she did a very deep and profound forgiveness. The next day when she came in, she was all aglow because she'd gotten an email of apology, a long email of apology from that aunt. And when they did the calculation, because there's a time difference between Sedona and Singapore, when she did the calculation of time, the aunt wrote that letter 3 hours after she had done the forgiveness. And so
Wow.
This is magical. Now, my first my Celtic one of my Celtic teachers was an archdruid, and he said, if something happens once, it's an event. If something happens twice, it's a coincidence. If it happens third time, it's a pattern. So let me give you a third story. I have a man in training who had done the Yogananda meditation for 45 years. He had known Yogananda when Yogananda was alive at the Mother Center in Los Angeles. As a young man, he'd been a model. He was very handsome. And when he would sit and meditate 45 years later, he looked like the perfect Western yogi. Perfect posture and bearded and looking very saintly. But as we could see with the mood scales, inside he was a deeply embittered, angry old man. And so as I'm quizzing him about the mood scales and why all this anger is showing up, and he said, well, I'm angry at my sister. And I said, I didn't know you had a sister. He goes, well, I haven't talked to her for 26 years. He had 10 siblings. He was on the outs with every single one of them. He probably knew to the minute when he cut off communication with that sister 26 years ago. So, following instructions, he goes and forgives the sister. And the next morning, that sister called him at the hotel. This training center was in California. Sister was 1,000 miles away in Utah. And when he did the forgiveness, she magically, transformationally, transcendently felt a shift in the energy. So she went to her Rolodex, found the last known number for this long gone brother. It was a work number. She called the number, and they said, yeah, he still works here, but he's not here. He's in California doing some brain training. And so because she could prove that she was a sister, they gave her the hotel number where he was staying, and she called the next morning, and brother and sister were reunited. So there are 3 examples of the magical transcendent effects of the Biocybernaut forgiveness. And so the second reason for me to be beginning now, coming out of the closet about the mystical sources of the effectiveness, is that because it's the truth, as I understand it. And why would I withhold the truth from people? If they're not ready for it, well, they're not ready for it. But if they're in the training and we give them some clues about, well, now, if you open this door, it's going to lead to more than just some good feelings. You're going to enter an entirely new world, like Hermann Hesse's Magic Kingdom. Some of the magic doors people don't open in their lifetimes. Well, I want people to have the opportunity to see the doors and then to be able to make an informed decision about whether to open those doors to the transcendent reality that awaits them as soon as they change their identities.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get into the practical applications of each brainwave and the mystical, spiritual, magical applications. So you have everyone start with alpha. Is there a reason why, and how would you break that down in real world and spiritual, mystical world?
Well, alpha 1 is like brainwave 101. You don't take a child who doesn't know how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide and try to teach them calculus or analytic geometry or differential equations. You don't teach a child who has a 200-word vocabulary creative writing. There are some basic skills that need to be acquired in order to, for example, a child that's just learning to crawl, you don't take them on a mountain climbing adventure. Okay. So there's a natural order to things. First, you plant, and then you reap. You don't reap before you plant. And just in terms of brainwaves, there's some very practical reasons. Pretty much every human has alpha going all the time. It might be big, it might be small, but it's there pretty much all the time. The thing is that we have a structure in our brains about intersection of these lines called the thalamus. There's a left and a right half of the thalamus. It's so complex, it's often called the brain within the brain. And it has pacemaker cells, tens of thousands of pacemaker cells that run 24/7, generating little bitty alpha waves. Now, the frequencies are random. They're not synchronized or coherent. And the way these tiny little waves get to the surface where we can pick them up is along what are called thalamocortical fibers. And so when we put the electrodes on the head, we're actually over some cortical columns that are connected by these thalamocortical fibers to the pacemaker cells in the thalamus. And depending on if, for example, one is going up and one is going down, they cancel each other. When they both go up and down together, their little voltages add up and you get bigger alpha waves. And so since these generators run 24/7, I mean, you can be awake, you can be asleep, you can be making love, you can be making dinner, you can be whitewater rafting, you can be skydiving, you can be meditating, and these generators are always running, always urging the surface of your brain, be an alpha, be an alpha. Now, what Shakespeare might call the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune often get in the way, and the ego uses the hindrances, doubt, drowsiness, distractibility, and worry, aversion, any form of ill will, boredom, and the one I added, forgetfulness, to keep you from going into these high alpha states in which doorways open to transcendent realities. And so, but the alpha is always there. There's always something to work with. Whereas theta, it's binary. It can be there or it cannot be there. And you can imagine the frustration that you would feel if you're lying there in the theta chairs. And yes, we have people do theta lying back in recliner chairs, where with alpha, you want to sit quite upright. Yogananda said, imagine when you're meditating, you have a hook in the middle of your head and your whole body is hung from that hook. So your spine is perfectly straight. But in theta, you want to, if you tried to do theta in a sitting posture, when you go into a reasonably large theta state, you lose postural tonus and you could literally fall out of the chair. So we have people lie back in recliner chairs. But even doing that, you might be there for half an hour and nothing is happening. There's no theta happening, nothing, noteworthy, nothing that runs the feedback tone. And so as people do alpha trainings, one of the things that happens is theta increases. This is why the Biocybernaut Alpha 1 training is like advanced Zen in a week. A study done in 1966 in Japan by two pillars of the Japanese scientific community, Dr. Kasamatsu and Dr. Harai, they wanted to measure brainwaves of Zen meditation. So they went to Zen masters in both of the traditions, Soto and Rinzai's, like in Christianity of Protestant Catholic. So they went to Zen masters in the Soto and Rinzai tradition, requesting very, very humbly permission to measure the brainwaves of the monks. Permission granted. Then they asked the Zen masters to rate the level of spiritual development of the monks, which they did, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And what they found immediately was that the higher the rated level of spiritual development, the more alpha in the meditation records. And there were details. In the beginners, which was usually 1 to 6 years in Zen as it's practiced in Japan, there was alpha increases at the back of the head. In the intermediate Zen, which was 6 to 21 years, that alpha spread forward on the head. And then only in the advanced Zen, which nobody in the study was rated advanced by the Zen master, who had less than 21 years of study, and some of them had 40 years. This is why I say the Biocybernaut training is like 21 to 40 years of Zen in a week. They had those two things happen. Alpha started at the back of the head, then spread forward. But in addition, the advanced had two more things happen. The frequency of the alpha slowed down a little, and theta waves began to be emitted from the frontal locations. That exact pattern happens in the Biocybernaut training. I published a paper in 1993 showing that this exact pattern of advanced Zen, which takes 21 to 40 years to develop in Japan, was happening to all of our Biocybernaut Alpha 1 trainees in their first week. So, I began promoting the idea that the Biocybernaut Alpha 1 training was like 21 to 40 years of Zen, advanced Zen in a week. Mm-hmm. Okay, so when people do the Alpha 1 training, their amount of theta increases, which makes them more likely to be successful in a Biocybernaut theta training, of which there are 24 levels. Mm-hmm. If they don't develop that much theta, I sometimes recommend that they do alpha 2 or alpha 3 in order to increase the amount of theta so that there's enough there to work with. Because alpha, everybody has all the time. It might be tiny, but it's there, and we can amplify it. We can turn up the gain, and so there's something to work with. But if there's no theta happening, spending 30 or 45 minutes lying in the chair with nothing happening can be kind of discouraging. And so we would never start people with the theta training. Alpha 1 is Brainwave 101, and that's where they start. After you do Alpha 1, you're eligible to go right on to Theta 1 if you want, or you can continue and do some more Alpha to get more Theta generating in the background so you have more to work with.
I noticed a huge improvement in my Theta from 1 to 2. I don't think I had any during Alpha 1. And then with Alpha 2, it just kept getting stronger and stronger and more organized. I was like, this is really cool to see your brain changing in real time. It's like the proof is right there. It's tangible and you see it. So for Alpha, you hear a lot of flow state and like peak performers. That's all trendy right now. That's also manifestation, right? If you get into the more spiritual aspects of it, and I guess being able to like have these opportunities come to you consciously. And then Theta is like accessing information. For some people, if you can get there, what would be like a real world application for Theta?
Well, in Theta, you have the ability to access the Akashic records. Akasha is a Sanskrit word which means primordial substance. And so in Theta, you can pull information out of the source of all information and then translate it into real world things. We can talk a little about Thomas Alva Edison. Everyone knows him as the inventor of the electric light bulb, but he also had pulled out of the Akashic records information for more than 1,000 patents. And we can talk about that in a moment. But I also have the brainwaves of a man who grew his company alone from zero to $200 million in 2 years. And he had the brainwaves to do that. He had big frontal theta and he had big occipital alpha. So with the big theta, he could pull information out of the Akashic records. And with the big alpha, he could creatively express that into the real world. And so, okay, this is very cool. He has in one brain the ability to access information not known to others. And then with the alpha, he has the means to be creative in assembling it into whatever ends he wants to put that information. So yes, the ability to pull information out of the Akashic records is, well, let's talk about Thomas Edison. We know that there are two kinds of theta. There's drowsy theta and there's mystical theta. They actually have different morphologies. Drowsy theta looks like little pointy croquet wickets, and mystical theta looks like slowed down alpha, and it's sinusoidal, unlike drowsy theta. And so Edison had somehow discovered that as he was falling asleep, he would often have brilliant ideas. So he designed his life, kind of a torturous regime. He would only sleep 4 hours a night, and often in two different stretches. So he'd sleep 2 hours, force himself to wake up, and then later he'd sleep another 2 hours. So guaranteed he would be drowsy during the day. And so his invention method consisted of having a comfortable recliner chair, a notepad with a pencil, pen, and then he would hold in each hand a large steel ball bearing and drape them over the arms of the chair. And then he would lie back in the chair and try to fall asleep while thinking of something he wanted to invent. Now, when you hit theta, you lose postural tonus. This is where I said, if you tried to do theta sitting up, as you lose postural tonus, you'd literally fall out of the chair. And so when he would hit theta, he would lose his grip and the ball bearings would drop. And he had metal pie pans under his hands, so they would drop with a clattering din and wake him up, and he'd grab a pen and write down whatever little bit of information he had pulled out of the Akashic records with that excursion into theta. Then he would pick up the ball bearings, lie back in the chair, and go for another dose. And so, in this way, he pulled information out of the Akashic records sufficient to write and win approval for over 1,000 patents. So, it's a very practical application of something that's inherently magical, mysterious, and wondrous. And so, the ability to do this empowers people in this world. Now, in terms of manifesting, I have found some differences in theta manifesting and alpha manifesting. And to relay this difference, I want to go to a Bible story. After the children of Israel had escaped from Egypt and they were wandering in the desert, God fed them with manna that would fall from heaven. It was nutritious, they could pick it up. But the thing was that the manna could not be saved. It would spoil. They had to trust in God, that God would feed them every day with manna falling from heaven. And so only on the day before the Sabbath, when they weren't supposed to work, could they gather double the amount and it wouldn't spoil. And so the idea was that it had to be in the moment and with trust. Well, what I've learned in manifesting in alpha is that you manifest, you get ideas and you know what to do, and then you make implementation in the real world. And I've manifested things that have endured for 30 and 40 years, where I had manifested them in alpha. Now, I am a victim of what's called mad car disease. Not mad cow disease, mad car disease. And I love classic cars, particularly GMs from the 60s. You know, these are not, $1 million Maseratis or things like that. They're like Pontiacs and Buicks and Oldsmobiles, things like that. And I, at one point, was fascinated with the Pontiac Grand Prix convertible. They only made it one year, 1967. And so I had actually found one. It wasn't the right color. It was a blue, but it was a sort of a robin's egg blue. And it really wasn't in the kind of condition that I wanted. And so I was doing a theta training where I was actually in the chamber. And I wanted a midnight blue Pontiac Grand Prix convertible. And so I'm in my theta training. And without even really consciously working on it, I saw it had hidden headlights. And so I'm in the chamber in the dark, lying down, and this Pontiac Grand Prix Midnight Blue drives up and stops with the grill about this far away from my face. And I go, wow, that is so cool. And I looked at it and admired it. And when the session was over, the technician gave me a phone number. Somebody had called during the session, and they had a midnight blue Pontiac Grand Prix convertible 1967 available for sale at some ridiculously low price. And it had all the trick features like power vent windows and, really, really cool. And so it was my favorite car, and I drove it to the training center almost every day. Then I got busy, and I didn't drive it for about 2 months. And then something happened, and I don't even remember the details, but it ended up, now it wasn't stolen, so it was some kind of legit transaction, but it ended up being owned by some tall Norwegian American who lived in Grass Valley up in the Sierras in California. And so what I realized was you can manifest very powerfully in very great detail in theta, but it's like manna from heaven unless you are using it, appreciating it, that it'll go away. You don't need it anymore. Okay, it goes away. It came from nowhere and it'll go back to nowhere. That's the basis of theta manifestations. Whereas you conceive something in alpha and create it, it's going to be there decades later.
That's so interesting. Yeah, you wouldn't, because a lot of people don't talk from a scientific standpoint about manifestation. It's either super woo-woo or people turn it off, but you have the technology and you have had the experiences. So it's really interesting to differentiate between the brainwaves and manifestation versus just, read this book, The Secret, and everything you want will happen. Like they're very different.
Well, let's talk about The Secret for a moment.
Sure.
Because there are 7 major mystical rays that come out of the central source. I've studied 2 of them. One, the Celtic ray, and the other, the Hermetic ray. And I've had deep exposure to the Celtic tradition. Mm-hmm. I've had 2 thrice masters as teachers. One of them was an archdruid. And I hung out at the periphery of a large, maybe 50 or 100 member Hermetic group for a while. And both of these traditions, the Celtic and the Hermetic tradition, understand that to do a work of magic or to manifest requires 3 things: desire, expectation, and merging. The desire needs to be strong. The expectation needs to be confident, because doubt is a killer. So you have to know that what you're desiring is going to happen. And then you have to merge. Now, the only definition of merging that I ever got out of the Archdruid was, he said, merging is when your awareness becomes one with the ground of being. Your awareness becomes one with the ground of being. Now, if you've done it, you go, oh my God, yeah, that's so right on. And if you haven't done it, you go, ground of being? What's that? And so most people have heard the expression, let go, let God. And so to a certain extent, merging is letting go. You've had to gin up the desire, had to be strong. You had to manifest the powerful expectation, confident expectation, but then you have to let it go. And you merge with it all. One way that I hold it is that you upload your individual desire and your individual expectation into the it all, to God, the source. And of course, nothing can resist that. It just happens. And so let go, let God. And in the training, we actually teach merging. It comes about naturally. We explain this to people on day 1 when we talk about the feedback tones, because we tell them to merge with the tones. Well, what's merging? Well, a green and a muddy river come together and you get a muddy green river. Or you have a flask of nitrogen and a flask of oxygen. You open the petcock and you get a merged mixture of nitrogen and oxygen. And so merging with the tones is particularly easy because the tones come from you. Now, we tell people that most, probably all the sounds that you've heard in your life come from outside of you. They're not you. Mm-hmm. A doorbell, a bird, an airplane, a car door slamming, somebody talking. It's not you. And so it's harder to merge with that. But the feedback tones are quintessentially you. It's an aspect of the substrates of your consciousness that we take out of you, amplify 100,000 times so that the tiny little brainwaves, just a few millions of a volt, are big enough for our computers to work with. And then we select out of there, like in the spectrum, from infrared to ultraviolet, we select out just the one color, just the alpha waves, and we turn that into beautiful musical sounds that people listen to. And even though it's coming in from outside them, it's coming in through their ears, it's really coming from within them. And so it's already you. It's just an aspect of you that's been externalized and turned into sound, but it's you, fundamentally and quintessentially you. And so it's easy to merge with. And the way to do that is, first of all, you talked about neuroplasticity. In order to have any changes in your brain functioning, you need feedback. And this facilitates the development of new circuits. And so we know that feedback is effective to the extent that it's 3 things: accurate, immediate, and reasonably aesthetic. Now, we don't use as feedback tones the sound of fingernails scratching on a blackboard, because that's unpleasant to most people. You don't want, when you make alpha, you don't want to be punished by hearing something unpleasant. So we make beautiful musical sounds for the feedback: flutes and oboes and clarinets and saxophones and organs, things like that. And so you have the positive aspect of the feedback. And we tell people on day 1, fall in love with the tones. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that you can do, is you can choose what you like. Bill Harris, in his last book, said that's one of the 4 things that people have control over, choosing what they like. And so you choose to fall in love with the tones, and then you become the tones. You feel that you and the tones are one, or the tones are pouring through you, or you're swimming in a sea of tones. All of these serve to have you merge with the tones. And once you learn merging with something that's externalized you, then it becomes much easier to practice that skill of merging on things that are not you. And that makes you a magician, because you now have the 3 elements: desire, confident expectation, and merging. And so people come out of the training and they have actually graduated from a school for Jedi Knights or a school for magicians. And it's not, like you said, it wasn't why you showed up at Biocybernaut. You wanted practical, real world benefits. And then you find out that, oh, well, those practical benefits actually are the result of mystical, magical, transcendent things that you sort of stumble into doing as you go through the procedures that I've set up for people to go through. It's like you would find a hard time crossing a river without getting wet. So it's a hard time going through a Biocybernaut session without opening a door to the magical worlds.
And so with merging, I had someone on when I first started the podcast. She's like a clairvoyant medium person, and she got into what she calls like sex magic. So is that similar with merging? Because I've heard when you're trying to manifest, especially if you're maybe not as skilled when it comes to that idea of merging or becoming like outside of yourself, that's like a good application is like when you're with your partner to manifest together.
That is a really beautiful question. It turns out in the late 1880s, there were two famous German sex magicians who used the experience of orgasm to create the merging, to activate whatever the desire and the expectation was. Now, it's hard or impossible during orgasm to have logical, analytical kinds of thinking. It's a transcendent moment. And oh, by the way, it's a very high alpha moment. Even people who don't have much alpha during orgasm, when they let go of the identity that they normally carry around, almost like a self-imposed cage, when they let go of that in order to have an orgasm, the alpha surges. In the same way that for example, voodoo. One of the methods in voodoo, you have the voodoo priest or priestess, and they have a bunch of followers, and there's some intent they have. Maybe it's a good intent, maybe it's a bad intent. They generate, maybe they do dancing or drumming or chanting to build up the desire and the expectation. And then at a certain moment, the voodoo priest or priestess cuts the head off a chicken, and everybody goes into shock, like, for a moment. And the voodoo priest or priestess gathers that energy, which is the contact with the unmanifest, and applies it to manifesting the whatever it is the intention was. Well, you don't have to cut a chicken's head off. All you have to do is have an orgasm. And so an orgasm without a conscious plan for what you want that state of consciousness to achieve for you, at some level is a waste. It's like going to a 5-star restaurant and ordering a full meal and only eating the salad. I mean, yeah, it's great salad, but what about the entree and, the dessert and, and so orgasms can be more efficacious in achieving your life goals than most people realize. But it's an understanding that desire, expectation, and merging. And as I said, I don't know the names, but I remember reading about two German sex magicians who were popular in the late 1880s. And they used sex magic because the orgasm is a way to break out of the logical, analytical cage that most people live in and have a moment of merging with the divine, with the transcendent.
Very cool stuff. So we talked a little bit about it in the beginning. It's the idea of changing your identity and neuroplasticity. And there's a lot of science, mainstream science, that says there's certain things like your personality is set in stone by 5, or that there are certain things that are incurable. So for specifically antisocial tendencies or disorders. So the main science is saying if you're a sociopath, that's a forever thing. If you're a narcissist, that's a forever thing. I had recently had Dr. Deborah So on, who is a neuroscientist that's done a lot of research with paraphilias and sex research and that sort of thing. And she was explaining in her research that things like pedophilia, for example, are biological. You're born with the specific brain that leads to these desires. So with these very dark and almost like a death sentence, right, in today's science as we know it, with your training, are you able to change the brain on that level? Like, can you take a brain of a psychopath and change it? Can you take the brain of someone who is born into a pedophile and change it? Have you had any of those like really intense types of personalities come through the door and walk out differently?
Absolutely. And that's a yes. A couple of things. We earlier talked about the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the granddaddy of all personality tests, which has 8 clinical scales: depression, anxiety, paranoia, schizophrenia, psychasthenia, mania, psychopathic deviancy, masculinity, femininity. And remember that brainwaves rule. You change your brainwaves, you change your identity. You change your identity, you change your reality, because identity and reality are synonymous. And I told you how, when I was asked to speak about my research to the entire psychiatry faculty of UCSF, and I was showing them personality profiles, MMPI profiles from before to after the training, 7 or 8 days apart. It frightened them so that 2 of the senior members of the department jumped out of their seats and started shaking their fists and waving their fingers, shouted me off the stage, because they had never seen, and they were afraid of seeing, a means, my technology, that could profoundly alter personality. Now, we have to be careful, because have I ever done this? Well, what I do is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. What I do is I provide the technology, I provide the training methods, I provide the coaching, but it's up to the people to change themselves. If you stand in front of a mirror, the mirror does not force you to smile or frown. If you are an actor or an actress and you want to practice your smile or frown for a particular part, a mirror is a perfect feedback device, because it's accurate and immediate. And so you pull the muscles of your face and a smile or a frown occurs. And so using the feedback, accurate and immediate, you can learn how to pull the muscles in your face to produce exactly the type of smile or the type of frown or grimace that you need for this role. And so one time early in my career, I was in the Camilla lab, and I was training a group of 20 students from San Francisco State. And it was fairly primitive. I mean, now the wires are mostly hidden, but everything was like exposed, all the technology and the wires. And this college student was there, and he was all impressed. Oh my God, look at all this technology. And then he sat down in the chamber and he said, okay, do it to me. And I just laughed, because I can't do anything to you. I put you in an environment where you have feedback, which is accurate and immediate and reasonably aesthetic, I hope. And it's up to you now to try things and then see what happens. Now, I'll tell you a story here related to that. I was in Canada working with the scholarship sponsor, who not only sent people from his company, but he put up $6 million and sent over 200 Canadian Aboriginal people into the training. Well, one of these was a high shaman in the Cree Nation. And if he was awake, he was praying in Cree, either out loud or, silently. And as I said, many of the Aboriginal people had been horrifically abused. They had post-traumatic stress disorder worse than many returning war veterans, because of the cultural abuse that they had endured, partly because of the residential schools. And he hated white people. And he hated especially white people in white jackets, because they represented the worst of white authority. Now, he was on scholarship, and so he was at one level polite, but he was baiting me. And he was going, oh, you white people, you're all the products of incest. And I go, well, what do you mean? He said, well, According to you white people's beliefs, the first man and woman were Adam and Eve, and they had children. Well, how did their children have children? Aha! You see, you're the products of incest. Children having sex with their brothers and sisters. And he said that was not true for us First Nations people because, you see, the first native people mated with aliens. Now, instead of going, oh, that's nonsense, I went and go, well, Drunvalo talks about how the two ET species, the Nephilim and the Hathor, were involved in early genetic experiments and genetic engineering with proto-humans to bring us into a larger and fuller and wider consciousness more quickly than evolution alone might do. So I could understand how maybe some of your early First Nations people might have mated with these aliens. And he goes, He wasn't getting the fight, the pushback that he was looking for. He wanted to make me wrong and make me the product of incest, put me down. And I wasn't having any of it. I was buying into his belief system, actually supporting and encouraging and providing information that he hadn't heard before. And so it changed the relationship. Now we kind of had a truce. It was not this jabbing all the time. So remember, if he's awake, he's praying either out loud or in his mind. So on the third day of his training, we're in the canopy room, and he's telling me about his session. He said, Doc, there were certain parts of my prayer today where the tones were louder. And I go, oh my God, that's absolutely amazing, because when there's something that you can do or not do that makes the tones louder, you're well on your way to mastery and control. So we sort of basked in that praise and acknowledgement for a while. And then I said, well, could you tell me what was the difference in your prayer when the tones were louder? And he goes, very good question. And he closes his eyes and he goes to think about it. And he says, well, Doc, when the tones were louder, I had more authenticity in my prayer and I felt closer to Creator. And I go, oh boy, this is wonderful. Now, we probably don't want to tell the CEO of this company who's coming next week for training about that. But between you and me, that's wonderful. And so we basked in that for a while, closer to Creator in those portions of the prayer where the tones were louder and more authenticity. So we basked in that for a while. And then I go, okay, now I have a challenge for you. He goes, what's that, Doc? I said, tomorrow, I would like you to bring, if you can, bring that greater authenticity in your prayer and the greater closeness to Creator into those parts of your prayer that didn't have it today. And his jaw dropped, and his eyes get big, and he goes, how is it that a white man can make me a better shaman? And so, depending on your brainwaves, you will have the experience of oneness. You'll be closer to Creator. You'll feel more authenticity. The man who owns the building in Germany, where I have my German training center, is a personal growth leader. He runs personal growth training programs. He was one of Drunvalo's teachers in the School of Remembering. And when he came to California to do the training, on the third day of his training, he said, would you bring this training to Europe? And I said, show me the building. And he said, well, I have a big house in Amsterdam, which is big enough for the whole training center. We had 6,000 square feet, plus rooms for the people to stay. And I said, I know Holland. It's called the Low Country. I said, what's the elevation of this house? And he goes, 5 meters below sea level. I go, no. At the time, I believed in global warming. I know now that we're actually going into a grand solar minimum. It's going to get colder. But I was worried, if you melt all the ice on Greenland, the oceans go up 20 feet. And you melt other ice, and, pretty soon, if you're 5 meters below sea level and you're protected by dikes, I didn't want to be flooded. So I said, no. He said, okay, well, I'll set the intention in my training that I'm going to sell my house and buy another house. So he does that. He gets back to Germany, and he gets back to Amsterdam, and he's got 10 messages on his answering machine from some guy who wants to buy his house. And so he's busy. He's just back. He's got to catch up. He doesn't respond. The next day, the guy calls again and leaves more messages. He isn't taking them yet. He's not there. So he calls his realtor and says, well, what should I ask for this house? And the realtor gives him a figure X. And so the third day he's back, the guy calls again, they connect, and the guy offers him 3 times X. So he sells the house. 2 months later, the real estate market collapsed. But now he has this big pocket full of euros, and he's wandering around Europe, and he buys this farmhouse. And the Biocybernaut Training Center is now built into what used to be the stable of that farmhouse, all renovated and nice wood and everything. But he said of the training that he rewrote all of his courses after his Alpha 1 training, because he said he felt more authenticity, and he realized he wasn't teaching, wasn't expressing authenticity. And he goes, how is it that a machine could make me more authentic? and so many, many wonderful stories of the magic that happens in the Biocybernaut trainings. There is one other question that you asked that I hadn't fully answered, and it was about the longevity of the results. Well, for example, we know that the average increase in IQ is 11.7 points. And we've also done tests to show that that increase is stable at least a year out. We haven't tested beyond a year, but there's no diminishment of the IQ gain for at least a year after the training. Now, when I wrote the federal grant, which was entitled Anxiety and Aging, I built in 6-month follow-ups and 12-month follow-ups because I was keen to know, like, a few of the psychiatrists at UCSF who were open said, well, these are amazing results, but do they last? I mean, I've never seen this kind of change, and certainly not that quickly. I've never seen somebody go from 98th percentile in schizophrenia or paranoia and then be in the middle of the normal zone ever, and certainly not in a week. But does it last? I didn't know. And so I designed this study so that we would have, of course, 2 pre and 1 post personality test batteries, but then again at 6 months and again at 12 months later. And to our utter astonishment, when people came back at 6 months, their personality profile results were better than they were in the day or two right after the training, which was way better than they were before the training. And so while we're scratching our heads trying to figure out how this was possible, another 6 months go by, we bring them back for their 12-month follow-up, and there are further improvements. So, I have to come up with some kind of understanding of why this could be. And what I realized, I didn't know yet at that time about when you change your identity, you change your reality. But I did know that when you fundamentally perceive the world more accurately, that world will change. And I came up with an analogy or the metaphor of, let's say you're born colorblind, and all your life you've seen black and white and shades of gray. That's it. Never saw a yellow, a red, a rose, a green. And so then something happens. Maybe you go to Lourdes and you put the sacred water in your eyes, or you have a miracle surgery, or you get struck by lightning. I mean, I don't know what the change cause is, but now you see colors. Well, every flower and every sunset is going to be just amazing for months. The novelty of it is going to be, bring bliss. But it's also going to change the way you live your life. Used to be when you went food shopping, you bought a can of this and a box of that. But now you're drawn by the colors of the fresh fruits and vegetables, and you buy and eat a healthier, more organic diet. And so your internal biochemistry starts to change. Or you go to the closet to get dressed, instead of putting on garish, clashing colors, because some people are like, oh, that guy's weird, or that girl is certainly not, with it. Now, that one change, how you assemble your wardrobe each day, changes the social networks that you have available to you. And so your circle of friends grows, expands, you have new social opportunities. And so when people in the alpha training fundamentally perceive reality more accurately, it changes everything about the way they live their lives. And that is ongoing. And that helps to explain why people's personality profiles are better after the training than before, and better at 6 months after than right before, and better at 12 months than 6 months.
I'm going to have to take that test again in a few months just to compare it to my exiting test. See what I get.
One thing that we noticed, like with the Aboriginals, the scholarship sponsor recognized that the degree of trauma in the Aboriginal people was so great that he offered to pay not just for their Alpha 1, but for their Alpha 2 and for their Alpha 3. He also had me count mercury fillings, and he would pay to have the mercury fillings taken out and replaced with something that wasn't as toxic. So he was very, very caring and loving toward those people. And so we administered the same battery of personality test to people before and after their alpha 1, before and after their alpha 2, and before and after their alpha 3. Now, most personality tests are designed to detect degrees of dysfunction. There aren't a lot of popular tests out there that measure bliss or transcendence or even happiness. It's the PsyCap, psychology of happiness. But so what we found was that the bad things would go down. When they came back, they didn't have as much of the bad things. So the bad things would go down further. And then when they came back for their alpha 3, the bad things would be very, very, very minimal, but they would go down. So the amount of reduction of the bad things in the training was less, but that was because they were coming back with fewer bad things. Mm-hmm. And so there are some scales like friendly and clear thinking, that continue to go up. And so the testing of people before and after is an important dimension. As I mentioned, the MMPI has 3 lie scales, one to detect faking bad, another to detect faking good, and another just general not telling the truth sort of randomly. And some of the clinical scales, about half of them, are corrected based on the lie scales. And so the test of EQ that we give is pretty simplistic by comparison. It has no lie scales. And sometimes people, rarely, but occasionally people will come in and have such an unrealistic view of how good they are and self-understanding or understanding others that they rate themselves unreasonably and inaccurately high. And then after spending a week of learning the reality of where they are with their self-understanding or their understanding of other people's emotions, they actually score lower. I can give you a personal example. When I was a first-year grad student in psychology, one of the second-year grad students was doing research on something called T groups. T stood for training. So about 150 people, me one of them, gathered in a big convention center on a Friday evening to stay until Sunday late afternoon. And we broke into 2 groups of 75. And first thing we did was we rated ourselves on how open we thought we were on a scale of 0 to 100. And I got, well, I'm pretty open. I'm here doing this work. And 60%. Okay, so then I spent the whole week weekend opening and opening. And at the end of the week, I was many times more open than I was when I started. But the grad student gave me the same test on a scale of 0 to 100 openness. Where are you? And I go, well, I'm way more open than I was at the start. But now I know that the openness dimension is so much vaster than I understood. So on a scale of 1 to 100, I could only give myself a 40. And I was the only person out of the 150 who rated myself lower in openness after. And so he came to me and he said, well, didn't you like the weekend? I thought, it was fabulous. He goes, well, why did you rate yourself lower? And I gave him this explanation. Because I recognized openness was a bigger dimension. And so on a scale of 0 to 100, you didn't give me an option to change the scale. I was now a 40. And he said, oh, that's too sophisticated an understanding. And he threw my data out. So it is the case on some occasions that people come in with lost in self-delusion about how good they are at reading other people's emotions or their own, that they score unrealistically high. And then after some truth-telling and some honesty are revealed about how open they really are and how good they are at reading other people's emotions, they could score themselves lower, even though they have enhanced these skills.
Mm-hmm. So with that, there seems to be like a level of self-awareness that you gain after the training. And even though, like you said, you might be scoring lower in some areas, it's just that you're more aware of the possibilities and where you can kind of grow to. Do you know who Jamie Wheal is?
Yes, I think he and I, he worked with another guy.
Stephen Kotler?
Yes, exactly. And I've actually spoken on the phone with Jamie.
Okay, so have you seen his recent talks and articles on the spiritual ego and how he's talking about how, because so many people, especially in Silicon Valley, are kind of recreationally and frequently doing psychedelics,
Microdosing.
they leave.
Yes.
Yeah. And even full journeys even. And they leave these experiences with an inflated ego,
Uh-huh.
and it's actually bigger than prior um to these trips.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious if any of your students have that same kind of hiccup, because it's kind of a paradox. So you go into this journey, or this path of enlightenment to get rid of the ego, and then you end up with a bigger one. So is that something that you think is strictly for psychedelics, or maybe because it's not in the right settings, or do you think that that can happen with the training as well?
A beautiful question. Um, Often lacking in those journeys is a trainer or guide. Now, Biocybernaut trainers go through not only uh, multiple brainwave trainings themselves, but there's a 2-month training of the trainer process where they uh, are at my side during 2 months worth of trainings. And so, in any personal growth, the ego is the obstacle uh, and works to undermine the growth. And psychedelics can give you a glimpse or even, a flood of insights. But if it's not embedded in a proper training protocol, it can actually, as you said, make it worse, a spiritual ego. And, there has been some comment about the leaders of the tech companies and the social media companies in California engaging in, shall we say, anti-democratic censorship and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not something that you do when you are even in going in the direction of enlightened being. You don't shut off points of view that you don't like or disagree with. So I can tell you a story that will illustrate the problem and the solution. In the history of my career, there have been periods as long as 8 or 9 months where I did not have my technology set up. Maybe the lab was moving, or I was going into a new state or something like that. I did move the training center to Raleigh, North Carolina at one point, or moved it around different places in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I would get calls from people whose friends had done the training, or family, and they were desperate to do the training. And I would say, well, I don't have the technology set up right now. I'm in the process of a move, but I could schedule you for, next March or something like that. And so then some of them would say, well, here in my town, downtown, there's like ABC Biofeedback on the corner, and they offer brainwave training. Do you suggest I go there to kind of like get a warm up until I can come with you and do the real thing? And I said, actually, no, I don't recommend that. And here's why. I said, have you heard of penicillin resistant gonorrhea? And they kind of like, well, what are you talking about sexually transmitted disease for? I go, well, I'm wanting to make a point. And they say, well, yeah, I have heard of it. And I said, do you know how it came about? It was kind of like a medical mystery. Where did penicillin resistant gonorrhea come from? And they say, no. So then I tell them the story. It used to be that the US military had military bases in the Philippines, tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors and airmen on these bases. Well, you have tens of thousands of horny young men. And so what's called into action are prostitutes, both male and female prostitutes. And the Philippine medical system leaks. And so it's very easy for non-prescription access to powerful antibiotics. And so the Philippine prostitutes, according to the research, were able to get their hands on penicillin, and they gave themselves everyday small doses. Well, as any microbiologist knows, that's a perfect way to develop an antibiotic resistant strain, is to give large members of the population small, non-lethal doses of the antibiotic. And I go, okay, now what's the comparison to the brainwave training? Well, the ego is like the gonorrhea. And if you go to down on the corner ABC ABC Biofeedback, and they don't have the Biocybernaut methods, and they don't have the Biocybernaut coaching, and they don't have the Biocybernaut technology, you're going to get a subcritical dose of information about how the ego works. And what the ego does is it learns how to resist the information of brainwave feedback done right. And so I would tell them the story and I'd say, well, now you have two choices. You can either wait to come to Biocybernaut, you know from your family or friends the power of the Biocybernaut, or you can, and against my recommendation, go to ABC Biofeedback down on the corner and get a subcritical dose of feedback, which will simply teach your ego how to resist the information that comes through properly developed and delivered brainwave feedback training.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had people do it both ways. Some people would wait and they would thrive in their Biocybernaut training. Others couldn't wait and they went to ABC Biofeedback and they would come in and their egos would be like these people in Silicon Valley that you're talking about, spiritual egos, and they would be primed to resist the coaching and the methods in a way that was not ever seen in people who hadn't taken these subcritical doses of brainwave feedback training. And so oftentimes when people do psychedelics, they don't have coaching and they don't, one of the big themes, as you know personally from having done Biocybernaut training, the ego is identified as the adversary. And the weapons, the tools that it uses, the hindrances, are explained in great detail. And you are trained to recognize when a thought starts to open in your mind. It's like an email that contains a virus. The servers will always delete those emails before it comes to your computer. Well, when a thought starts to open in your mind that has one or more of the hindrances in it, you're trained to delete that thought so it doesn't open, doesn't take over your awareness. And so you can go and do psychedelics, but if not done with the appropriate guidance, you run the risk of developing an inflated ego that will then more effectively block any personal growth, spiritual growth, or expansion of consciousness that you are really seeking.
Mm-hmm. So is there, well, a two-part question. How do you distinguish what's you and what's your ego? And is it possible to kill your ego? Because a thing that you hear a lot
Is it
of the time
possible to
is
what? I missed the
ego
word.
to kill your ego. Because the thing
No.
that I hear a lot is ego death, and that's confusing to me.
Well, I remember telling you about this multimillionaire oil man that brought me to India.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He was away with the film crew at a rat temple in northern India filming when I got there. So the first 5 days I was alone in Bombay in the Oberoi Hotel, then owned by the King of Nepal, setting up the equipment and so on. And when he came back, he walked into the room and he thumped his chest. He goes, "I killed my ego." Oh boy, this is going to be a long journey. And he was a multiple personality, some raging, angry drunks, others, kind, charitable, philanthropic. And sometimes I had to wait like 3 days for somebody to show up that I could talk to. But yeah, Ramdas said, as long as you have a body, you have an ego. Now, it might be big and obtrusive and get on people, or it can be subtle and evanescent and rarely in evidence, but it's always there and you cannot kill it. The only time it disintegrates is when you drop your body. And so that's not, a very effective way, but you can diminish it. You can learn how to discipline, and you can learn how to recognize its efforts to undermine your personal growth methods or even your happiness by memorizing the 5 hindrances. One of the drawings that I often, hand drawings that I make to show people, I draw a little face and I draw a big screen and I say, this is you and this is the screen of your reality. The sounds and the images and the smells, and it all comes to you from the screen of reality. And then over on the side, I draw a bootleg projector, one of those old tripods, old projectors. And I say, this is ego, which makes up movies and projects them onto the screen of your reality. And if you haven't been trained to recognize a perception based on the hindrances, you will take in the false images that the ego projects into your reality, and you'll accept them as real and then, go down the path to destruction or, inhibition of your skills, your talents, your abilities. And so recognizing, well, let me give you a story. At one point, I had built, I was asked by a wealthy family to put a training center on their estate in St. Charles, Illinois. And I was there from May through November, trained all the family members. It was a family owned company, and many wonderful stories of how people benefited from that. But one of the trainings there was three guys, and two of them were cousins. Another was a creative director of a creative company. And they all evoked their higher self to help them in their forgiveness work. This was before we had the 14-step method. And so when they were dealing with a problem in forgiveness, they would call on their higher self. For two of them, it was a tall, robed, bearded, very stately, almost saintly looking character. And for the third person, it was a radiant child. And he'd be having problems with forgiveness. He'd call on the radiant child. It would come in smiling and radiating good energy. And it would give him advice that was kind, loving, and always effective in doing the forgiveness. Okay, so that went on for several days. He's doing great. And then he's had a problem forgiving. He calls on the radiant child. It comes in. Looks exactly like it always did. And he gives him advice that's vicious, mean-spirited, and cruel. And so immediately he grabs it by the neck, puts one hand on the head, and pops the head off. And inside is Tasmania, the cartoon character, the Tasmanian devil that runs around like that, bringing bad vibes everywhere he goes. And so why did he do that? Well, he recognized that where the radiant child was giving him advice that was kind, gentle, loving, and effective, now it was giving him advice that was vicious, mean-spirited, and cruel. And he recognized that the ego had gotten up in drag to impersonate the one that he was taking advice from. And so ego will do that. It has the ability to corrupt your perceptions. And so you need to be on guard. This is why you need in your toolkit, in your quiver, you need the arrows where you know what the hindrances are: doubt, drowsiness, distractibility and worry, which includes all form of fear, aversion, any form of ill will, boredom, and then the one I added, which is forgetfulness. And so when a thought starts to open in your mind, you run the scan on it. Does this contain a hindrance or two or three? If so, you delete that thought, saying, thank you, I don't need to think that way anymore. And so one of the signers of the American Declaration of Independence wrote famously, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So you need to constantly monitor, because ego has only one objective: control you. And it is not going to take a day off where you can not worry about it. And so you constantly need to monitor your perceptions. It becomes automatic after a while. But then, if once every 2 weeks a bad thought comes up, you go, oh, I see you, ego. And you name the hindrance and you dismiss the ego. But you need to be eternally vigilant in order to have the liberty of higher consciousness.
Have you heard of the Ego Eradicator breathwork? It's similar. It incorporates like Kundalini breathwork. I just saw it popped up on my newsfeed today, and I had to ask you if it was something you were familiar with.
I'm not.
So it was Russell Brand that did a little tutorial on Twitter today about it, and he was saying that you put your thumbs out like this, you focus on like your third eyebrow spot, and you keep your arms kind of wide at a Y, and you do like, it's 1 minute in through your nose and really fast, almost like hyperventilating breaths, and then out through your mouth in the same way. And then you have to hold it and imagine roots kind of going down into the earth, and you hold it for as long as you can. And then at the end, you make this very big exhale, and it's supposed to help specifically with the ego. So I was curious, if you practice that. I was like, it's perfect timing for my podcast.
Well, when I got back from my breakthrough experience in Joe Kamiya's lab, I wanted to tell people about it. It was like the most amazing thing that ever happened to me in my whole life. And in my senior year at Carnegie Institute of Technology, senior year in physics, I set up an exchange program between the psych department at Duquesne University where they had French Jesuit priests teaching phenomenology, a science of consciousness, science of experience, and our department, which was largely rat runners. And so I had met a professor there, Dr. Rolf von Eckertsberg. Now, Rolf had been a grad student at Harvard under Timothy Leary, and he had taken tons of LSD. He'd lived at the community at Millbrook and taken tons of LSD. He met his wife. Their 3 children were all conceived on LSD, conscious creation. And so whatever Rolf was doing, like giving a class, what he's really doing is witnessing himself, studying the processes of his consciousness as it changes, as he does whatever it does. And that could be giving a class, making love with his wife, canoeing down a river with his children. He was always studying his awareness. And so I go, well, if anybody's going to know what happened to me, it's going to be Rolf. And so he had a house, a rented house, one of the robber baron era houses in Pittsburgh, so big that the top floor had maids' quarters for a dozen maids. I mean, this was a vast house, and he was renting it. So I walk up the hill. It's right off campus. And I walk into his big study, and he looks at me, and he sees that I'm different. And he goes, like, sit down. And he takes his left arm, and he sweeps everything off the desk onto a floor, folds his hands, and he says, okay, now tell me, what's happened to you? So I spend the next maybe 2.5 or 3 hours detailing everything that happened to me in Joe Camilla's lab. Partway through this talk, a neighbor lady comes in, stands respectfully in the distance for a while listening, then leaves, and then a little while later she comes back with a book, and she walks over to my side of the desk, puts the book down, and then leaves. And I continue the conversation with Rolf. At the end, I look at the book. It's the autobiography of a yogi by Yogananda, which 2 weeks earlier I would have, this is just nonsense. Look at it. It's crazy things he's talking about. But now I read it. I shared it with my roommate, who was a grad student at Duquesne studying phenomenology. He ordered the correspondence lessons from the Self-Realization Fellowship. And together, for some years, he and I did the Yogananda lessons. We were both initiated into Kriya Yoga by one of Yogananda's direct disciples, Swami Kriyananda, at the Ananda Cooperative Village in Grass Valley, California. And so I was deeply imbued with this tradition. And so Yogananda, speaking of breathing, says that you should never even try to meditate unless you do these breathing exercises. The first breathing exercise we did for, I don't know, a couple of years. And then there was a second, more advanced one that would come along called the Hong Saw method. And when I was in India, I talked to yogi teachers who said they don't teach people meditation for 2 years. And the first thing they do for 2 years is they teach them breathing practices. So I'm very aware of and respectful of the power of breathing. Now, it turns out in the Biocybernaut chamber, oftentimes there are certain states of consciousness where it's like an awareness larger than the person comes in, and it breathes them. It causes them to breathe in certain ways that advance their consciousness. But there are also breathing practices, and we will be introducing some of these soon into the training. In fact, there'll be special trainings that will feature certain breathing exercises. We have already years ago built into the Cybernaut program that runs everything, a pre-training and a post-training meditation period during which there will be some special breathing practices coming soon to the Biocybernaut Center near you. So I'm beyond excited and delighted about the power of breath, and as an auxiliary, as an aid to the more powerful alpha feedback process. I 100% endorse it.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
somebody who says that it's an ego eradicator, the people who say that they have an ego eradicator, I say, I think you're exaggerating. You can diminish it, which is the goal, of course, but eradication, as long as you have a body, you have an ego.
Now, is there an evolutionary purpose to that, or a spiritual purpose? And is it only humans that have an ego?
That's a why question. Why do we have an ego? I found at Biocybernaut, it's far more productive to learn how to diminish the influence of the ego, how to minimize it, than to ask, like, well, why do we have one? I think,
Mm.
asking God would probably be a better way than asking me.
That's fair enough.
But I can tell
Um,
you, how to diminish it and live a better life as a result.
yeah, go to Alpha 1 training. Start
Mhm.
with Alpha 1 training. Um, so I wanted to kind of end on the note of global consciousness.
Mhm.
And what we talked about a little bit earlier was, let me see if I had it, and then was the yugas and like global cycles, things like of that nature. So if we are in what they call a Kali Yuga, which is a state of chaos, or with numerology, a lot of numerologists are saying we're in a 9, which is closing out a lot of unfinished business. It can be very chaotic. It forces you to look at some ugly truths in order to evolve. And hopefully, I think the end goal for both of those thoughts are to end in this golden age, which is something that you actively try to participate in and usher in. And that's part of your mission statement for where Biocybernaut. So,
Correct.
for all of these people that are having a very hard time with 2020 and 2021, do you have any, I guess, small steps that we can take to collectively head into this golden age?
Mindfulness. Within even the worst chaos, with the appropriate consciousness, you can thrive.
Mm,
Drunvalo told a story about, he was actually in Peru visiting Inca temples, and there was a group of Japanese on tour, and he met this man who was held in almost godlike reverence by all the other people, and he connected with the guy, and they interacted, even though the guy didn't know any English and Drinvo didn't know any Japanese. They interacted profoundly and deeply for some hours. Later, people in the group took him aside and said, "Well, do you know who that is?" And he goes, "No." And here was the guy's story. And this is a story about, depending on your consciousness, you can thrive in chaos. He was in Hiroshima when the nuclear bomb went off. And he
mm,
saw the flash, and he saw this wave of destruction coming toward him. And he sat down and he said, "This will not affect me." The next day, when rescue workers were going through the ruins, they found this guy sitting naked there. All his clothes had been incinerated, burned off, and blown away. And he was completely intact. Completely intact. Uh, he was obviously revered as a national treasure in Japan, but it's an example of how doesn't matter what's going on. A nuclear bomb is going off. You're going into a dark age. A dictatorship and censorship have taken over the land, and freedom of speech has been extinguished. And people are being put in jail for not having the right attitudes, not enough
mm-hmm,
social credit, like in China.
mm-hmm,
And this doesn't have to affect you. Uh, and so the idea is that how not to lose your head when everyone around you is losing theirs. And it's a matter of sufficiently high consciousness. The guy who survived the Hiroshima nuclear bomb blast is an example. He's a human being. His heart pumps, blood goes through his body as brainwaves. And I never got to see his brainwaves, but he was an ordinary Japanese man with
mm-hmm,
extraordinary abilities. And so the important thing to do is to be responsible for improvements that you can be responsible for. You may not be able to stop the person over there who wants to, put all the people he doesn't like in jail, um, or censor people so they can't say anything he doesn't like. But what you can do is you can develop your own consciousness. You might remember that you and I had an encounter recently where something went wrong with the technology, and instead of being disappointed, I said, that was really a good thing, and this is why it was a good thing. And so, you remember? Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
it made
so,
me feel a lot better. I'm like, you can choose how you feel about this situation.
exactly. You always have that power. And
Hmm.
uh, one of my dear friends had a quote that indicated that um, sorrow follows a negative thought. Uh, uh, we think bad, we become what we think, whereas, happiness and joy follows a positive thought. And so we're talking about more than thoughts. We're talking about the brainwaves that underlie both thoughts and emotions. And when you can run those positive brainwaves, uh, you can feel better. And even more importantly, because emotions are even below beliefs, you can have healthier beliefs, but even above that, you can have a wonderful identity, which in the having of which will alter your reality. And what a nice skill to have.
It's so beautiful. And it makes me think of the example you gave earlier on, which was the small, or I shouldn't even say small, but the profound changes that you do see with the training and how that has a protagon effect on people around you. So even by adopting this small first step of mindfulness, that can also have a ripple effect, and instead of living in this age of chaos or this 9 cycle or this Kali Yuga, that we could actually go into this golden age, and hopefully a lot faster than what Wikipedia is saying.
Well, as you mentioned, that's part of the mission statement of Biocybernaut. Fully, it's
Hmm.
to reduce suffering, to expand awareness, and to usher in an enduring golden age for all humanity. And we know
Hmm.
that by changing our brainwaves, we can change our identity and we can change the reality and bring this in. And so it's within our grasp. We have the means to do this. Now, regarding mindfulness, mindfulness is globally a multi-billion-dollar industry. People in all walks of life have become interested in mindfulness. I've actually written a paper on this, which is available to everyone for free online. It's in the British online journal, EC, Psychology and Psychiatry. That's E as in Edward, C as in Charlie, EC, Psychology and Psychiatry. And you can go and search there, and there's an article entitled The Quest for Mindfulness. And you can learn a lot about what you can do on your own there.
Wonderful stuff. So, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time, being very generous with all of these technical issues we had earlier on. Do you want to tell the listeners where they can find more of your work and learn more about Biocybernaut?
Sure. The website, www.biocybernaut.com, will take you on quite an odyssey, quite an adventure. You can sign up for trainings. There's a publication section where there's a lot of papers, some of them for the lay audience, some of them more technical and scientific, that you can read to discover the science behind the powerful effects that we have. There's also various forums that you can participate. There's an alumni section of the website that all the graduates can gather in, and we talk there about issues and problems and solutions. You could also get a copy of my book on Amazon. It's called The Art of Smart Thinking, and when it was introduced, it actually rose to number 3 on Amazon for a
Oh,
while.
wow.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And when it dropped
Yeah.
off of that, it was number 1 in the subcategory of memory improvement for many months. The Art of Smart Thinking by Dr. James Hardt on Amazon.
Awesome. Yeah. And then I'll record an intro after this, but just to reiterate to the listeners, we do have 3 autographed copies that we will be giving away. So you could win your very own copy of this book signed by the one and only Dr. Hart. So again, thank you so much. I can't wait to see you again, talk to you again, and I really appreciate you.
It's been a delight hanging out with you. Really appreciate you and your wonderful, deep, and thought-provoking and miracle-exposing questions.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening. That's it for this week's episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You can also share this podcast with a friend. It helps my podcast grow, and I really appreciate it. I hope to see you next week.